Good day. Let us continue what we have discussed previously. Professor Salsaloi prepared this lecture series for students' convenience to easily access important points in describing human nature from the standpoint of Western philosophy. Again, here, we are limited to understanding human nature from the philosophies of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Marx. In the first part of this lecture series, humans by nature, as described by Socrates, are socially inclined. Inasmuch as humans have to relate with their fellow humans, one has to cultivate his attitude by acquiring knowledge and virtue to eventually gain wisdom. Moreover, Plato illustrated that a human person has three parts of the soul. Namely, the rational part, appetitive part, and spiritual part. He pointed out, however, that it is the rational part of the soul that controls his appetite and assertion of the spirit as it utilizes reason. At this moment, therefore, we will dive into this messy rabbit hole and continue to understand us, humans, in our nature. Let us continue with Plato's student, Aristotle. Contrary to what Plato has thought of, Aristotle, his student, maintained that there is no dichotomy between man's body and soul. Body and soul are in the state of unity. In this unity, the soul acts as the perfect or full realization of the body, while the body is a material entity which has the potential for life. Per se, the body has no life. It can only possess life when it is united with the soul. In this regard, Aristotle speaks of the man as a single essence composed of body and soul. Man's body matter and man's soul form. That is why he speaks of soul as the body's perfect realization, because form for him is the perfect realization of matter. Soul is the principle of life. It causes the body to live. The body is matter to the soul and the soul form to the body. Body and soul, therefore, are inseparable. They constitute man as a whole. If the soul, however, is the principle of life, the problem is that not all bodies are human bodies. The solution to this problem is Aristotle's concept of the kinds of soul. According to the philosopher, there are three kinds of soul: vegetative, sensitive, and rational. Vegetative is the lowest type, which is found in all living things. Sensitive soul exists in animals. And rational soul exists only in man. That is why for Aristotle this is the highest kind of soul, because it has the power to unite itself with the lower parts, the vegetative and sensitive. For Aristotle, vegetative soul is capable of following functions: it feeds itself, and it reproduces. On the other hand, the sensitive soul has these functions: it feeds itself, it grows, it reproduces, and it has feelings. The rational soul ranks highest because it assumes the function of the vegetative and sensitive souls. Besides, it is capable of thinking, reasoning, and willing. Man, therefore, in possession of the rational soul is higher than the brutes, animals, and plants. Man is capable of thinking and judging aside from sensing and growing. Aristotle rejects the idea of Plato on the dichotomy of the soul and the body, and also of Plato's idea on the pre-existence of the soul prior to the body. But Aristotle, like Plato, advocates reason as man's highest faculty, because reason distinguishes man from other forms of life-possessing beings like plants and brutes. Indeed, Aristotle has a point. This may ask one, as to whether the essence of man is already in man prior to birth, or, as Plato has argued, the soul is simply encapsulated into the body that makes the body simply a container of the soul. Well, we could no longer ask these brilliant men to clarify their point concerning this issue. Debates, however, on this is evident in the emergence of rationalism and empiricism in the modern period of philosophy. Speaking of modernity, let us now discuss the description of human nature based on the philosophy of Rene Descartes, the acclaimed father of modern philosophy. Rene Descartes' philosophy is a rebellion against the existing philosophy at his time. His view of man is founded in his idea of substance. By substance, he means anything that exists independently of others' existence. In other words, Descartes is saying that substance exists by itself. Descartes, however, does not recognize the man issue as a flaw in his philosophical system, but instead, he considers it as a crucial in his coming to grips with the fact of the created world. He, then, qualifies his idea of substance by accepting the reality of substance in the created world. In elucidating this, he draws a distinction between God as the infinite substance and man as the finite substance. In saying this, we can immediately pinpoint a seeming inconsistency in his idea of substance. If finite substance is created, therefore, it cannot be considered as substance. So, if man is a finite substance, then man cannot be qualified as substance, because man does not exist by himself but through God. This, which is recognized as abstruse, cannot be understood unless one takes into account Descartes' contention. Substance, for Descartes, cannot be predicted in a univocal manner to both God and creatures by the fact that God is the creator while substances are just created. Notwithstanding, finite substance is qualified by Descartes as a substance because it is not dependent on anything in the world. Finite substance is entirely autonomous, although it is dependent on God. Substance, although it is only one, is classified by Descartes in two kinds, namely, infinite and finite, as stated earlier. Man, for Descartes, is finite substance. Through this, Descartes presents his ultra-dualistic substance theory of man. Man, as a finite substance, is both a thinking substance and an extended substance. In his own terms, Descartes calls thinking substance res cogitans and extended substance res extensa. What does he mean by these? Res extensa. The term refers to the body of man. By body, Descartes means anything that has a figure. It is confined to a particular space and time. It is sensible. It can be touched. It can be felt. It has weight. And it has color. These are the accidental features of res extensa. Res cogitans. The term refers to the soul of man. The soul is the spiritual substance which is the first immediate evident fact in the finite substance. For Descartes, the essence or nature of soul is to think. Because of this, it cannot describe to any material fact. It is independent of the material world because thinking does not have properties, like those of res extensa. At this point, the discussion has already established a clearing that puts a delineating line between res extensa and res cogitans. The two are independent of each other because, for Descartes, each of them is a substance. There is no interpository issue between res extensa and res cogitans in the Cartesian philosophy. The two substances unified whole on the ground that philosophy man takes man as a whole. Therefore one cannot leave Descartes in his too exclusive a discussion on both the extended and the thinking substance in mind. For Descartes, the soul, instead of giving man life, it gives man consciousness. Though consciousness, thinking become the all-embracing reality. Descartes says that consciousness has two states which he calls the passive and active. The former refers to sensation and knowledge, while the latter pertains to the forms in man's will. In this, it becomes clear that Descartes contends against the scholastic view of knowledge that runs, nothing can be known apart from the senses. With his idea, knowledge is possible apart from the body. Is it acceptable? It cannot be denied that there are aspects of knowledge which do not require the use of the senses. What about love, justice, liberty, truth, equality, and the like? The safest to say is that not all knowledge requires the senses, and not all the knowledge categorically throws overboard all the issues of the senses. A shocking statement had been forwarded by Descartes when he said that it is not the soul that makes man's body life, because for him, the human body is a machine. Life and motion are not brought about by the soul, but by the vital motion that comes from without man, which the thinker calls spiritus animals, or animal spirit. These animal spirits are generated by the blood and its warmth. The direction starts from the heart, to the brain, then to the nerves muscles of man, causing man to move. The next issue that needs to be under cover is death. If res extensa is a substance, then, is it possible that a dead body can still move? However, one knows that a cadaver is a dead body. It is practically inconceivable that it can move. But, Descartes views death in a entirely different perspective. He does not argue, however, that a body can still move. To Descartes, death comes to man only when the principal part of the human body is broken or damaged, not that the soul departs from body. Such is evident in a vehicular accident, murder, natural death, or any form of death. A victim would die if his blood is drained or his heart or brain are damaged, since they are central organs which the spirit as animals operates. Therefore, in Cartesian philosophy, there are 5 factors governing life: viz. Animal spirits, blood and its warmth, heart, brain, and muscles and nerves. Yes, I know. Sir Boney would dub Descartes in this part of his philosophy as a labyrinth of substances. Anyway, Descartes would only want us to understand that human persons are both a thinking being, a res cogitans, and an physically existing being, or res extensa. We are a thinking being extended with a bodily substance that serve as a machine to execute the will of our mind. However, the mind does not cause life to the body, which is contrary to what Aristotle argued. It causes its own life through its spiritus animalis, that is in our layman's understanding, the bodily reflexes to live. Now, let us go to another philosopher whose concern man's natural capacity to produce as his way to create a meaningful existence. He is Karl Marx in his Dialectics. For Karl Marx, human dignity is to be found in human labor. Human labor transforms nature into a meaningful whole. At the same time, it also transforms man, giving his life meaning and purpose, for through labor man expresses his creativity. Production changes the state of things into something useful for humankind. But labor too changes the life of man and the way he relates with the world and his fellow men. Marx was influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach and G.W.F. Hegel. Feuerbach wrote that reality is material. Such is based on the idea that man struggles as a material being. He needs material provisions in order to live. He finds meaning in the material conditions of his life. Life in this sense is an informed matter. There is nothing beyond the material existence of man. Anything that is transcendental is a projection of man's insecurity. Man, according to Feuerbach, is an imperfect being. Thus, man's projection of anything transcendental is a reflection of this inadequacy. Hegel taught that history is the self-realization of the spirit. The dialectic of human history, therefore, is the self-realization of spirit in the world. The spirit first realizes itself through nature, and then through man, and lastly through reason. The spirit is the realization of rationality, is the finality or telos of human history. Marx developed his philosophy from Feuerbach and Hegel. He agreed with Feuerbach that the very substance by which nature is governed is ultimately material. He agreed with Hegel that there is self-realization in history, but this self-realization is not the self-realization of the spirit, but the self-realization of man's material nature. Thus, history is the dialectic or self-realization of the material nature of man. History suggests that life, in the beginning, is less complex, a way of sharing the wealth of nature. Production was unnecessary. But the movements of history have directed the man to a more tedious and less acceptable state of being. Man has to build and rebuild societies. Man has to design a mode of living as the world became more complicated. Today, the meaning of being human becomes more visible. Man completes himself and his political and economic existence. The reason for such is that his political and economic interests govern the activity of the world, and therefore, the end and purpose of history. Man fulfills himself in the actualization of his economic and political interests. The actualization, however, is not permitted by the present scheme of things. The human is alienated. The most apparent form of alienation is material or economic. Material or economic alienation also results in human alienation. In alienated labor, man ceases to be. The most glaring reality about it is that it is a painful fact, painful because it is the opposite of what man desires. It is the antithesis of the ideal state of humanity. The human being needs to live a decent life, but the forces of production prohibit him from having such a life. According to Marx, if the product of labor is alienated, the production itself must be active alienation. Not even sincere hard work can free man from the bondage of inequality, because in today's world the poor worker as an activity is always already an alienating activity, a detachment from the truth. The sad fact is that those who work harder, those who sacrifice their bodies for the sake of achieving production quotas, end up with empty hands at the end of the day. They suffer because they are poor. They are sacrificed because they are uneducated and powerless. Simply put, alienation is man's detachment from reality, his divorce from the truth of his being conscious species who should freely govern his life. Man is no longer in control of his life. The capitalist is in control of his life the way it is lived. This is not by some way of conjecture, but economic and material alienation, as some believe, is the mother of all miseries. Marx says, the more the worker exerts himself, the more powerful becomes the alien objective world which he fashions against himself. The poorer he in his inner world become, the less there is that belongs to him. The truth of the matter is that man suffers in life because of material depravity. A farmer, for instance, has to sell his livestock at a certain price, and in return, buy other goods that are less quality than what he produces. He forgoes meat in exchange for fish paste because he needs to survive. Thus, Marx says that when the worker puts his life into the object, then it no longer belongs to him but to the object. Those who toil hard to erect buildings and other structures find out what they have created as an alien thing. For whatever the carpenter and masons build beautiful schools, the more expensive the school becomes, denying their children the kind of education such institution may offer. Thus, for Marx, the worker becomes all poorer the more wealth he produces. For instance, with the wealth and power created by a capitalistic society, the height and colors of magnificent structures make the sight of the poor to many of us. Man becomes alienated from his fellow man. The poor man shelters himself in an adobe not suited to the very dignity of his being as a man. The poor man, as an alienated being, lives under the bridge, or inside a dilapidated building, or neath the river banks not because he wants to be there, but because he is so marginalized that he has no other place to go except the place that the elite shun. Alienation separates man from his fellow man, reducing life to misery. The reason for the above is that labor has become a cheap commodity. The reason being is that labor has been objectified, and so is man. Man, according to Marx, has become a valueless entity in the reality of a capitalistic economy. Thus, the tears of the little children of poor people who live in shanties, whose parents do not own a place that will secure them against the elements of the earth, whose lives revolve around the daily fear of having their simple adobe being demolished, will be left unheard, for the giant equipment that will tear their homes does not have a heart for the poor. Why has man become meaningless in a capital-driven state? Marx says that the poor worker is dehumanized. This happens because capital dominates man. The capitalists in this sense control the way things are and the way things will be. Thus, Marx says that in alienated labor, man's life belongs to him no more but to the capitalist. Marx has described a society that recognizes wealth as a way to actualize one's nature as a human being in a capitalistic society. As for Sorbonne, projecting the idea that human nature is established by man as a politically inclined economic entity, labor, as one's commodity, defines human dignity. Hence, human nature for Karl Marx is actualized through his labor as a being with dignity. The forces of capitalism may impede man's dignity inasmuch as labor does not meet the needs of man as a dignified being. Man is alienated in his labor. His labor represents his being as a material entity. He loses himself in the process of producing goods that he doesn't enjoy. He loses his identity in the goods he produced as they become commodities owned by the capitalists. Boni, however, emphasized that the context of Marx's philosophy is industrialization. A time when capitalism is at its height, a time when people are hungry for producing surpluses. The transition from feudalism to capitalism has brought a huge impact on the structure of the society that affected the poor ungraciously. The 19th century was the time when the advancement of production technology has replaced human labor. And so poor people competed with the speed of production made by machines and have left them paid cheaply. This cheap labor has destroyed the dignity of man. He is alienated. Hence, he became alienated from his nature as a human being worthy to live a decent life and good education. If you have questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. Sir Boni will be glad to respond. Thank you for watching.